Well, the first round of the French election is this Sunday, with the runoff going to be on May the 7th. So we're going to have a look at what France's chart looks like and who's in the running. So here we've got a list of all the contenders. So we've got Marine Le Pen, of course. We have there Emmanuel Macron, who they're saying is the Tony Blair, Bill Clinton type candidate. We have Francois Fillon, who you know there's been a lot of controversy around him. I think he's like the Basil Fawlty candidate, the way he's been carrying on. Hamon, who you see there's dropped off. They're saying he's like the Jeremy Corbyn candidate. There's also Mélenchon, who's at a sudden rise in the polls. They're calling him the Hugo Chavez of the French election. And a very large amount of undecided voters. So have you seen there's like a who's who of world politics all blended into the French election. The only thing we seem to be missing is the French version of Kim Jong-il. So maybe if there was such a person, the whole thing would just go kapow. But lurking underneath this, we have a contender. It's probably Vladimir Putin, because no election is complete these days without an allegation of Russian hacking. So I'm sure he'll be manipulating events somehow, maybe through chemtrails or ultra low frequencies, so you never know. So things have been moving fast in the last week. As we've got closer to the first round, the sort of odds have narrowed. The stats are somewhat like this. Macron has narrowed the gap between himself and Marine Le Pen. There's been the surge from Mélenchon. Hamon has just dropped right off, and Fillon is hanging in there. But the interesting thing is Marine Le Pen's support is very strong. Her support is not likely to waver. So when you're looking at her percentage there, that's really, really solid. Whereas with Emmanuel Macron, apparently 30% of the people who are currently saying they will vote for him may not. They're not really sure, they may go the other way. So that 21% there is not as definite as it sounds, which means Francois Fillon is still very much in the running. And you've got to know that his support is strong, because even though it dropped down to about 16% when there were the allegations, well, I'm not sure if it's just allegations, seems quite substantive about his wife being paid for a job she never really did, and his children taking up to almost £1 million collectively through the EU Parliament. That doesn't seem to have hurt him, which tells me his support is very, very solid. Hamon's just hemorrhaged support. I think a lot of his support has gone towards Macron, who's been putting a heavy push on. And Mélenchon, he's the candidate, is quite interesting. He is similar to Le Pen in the way. He's not very keen on the European Union. He wants to take France out of the euro, out of the European Union. He's quite keen on Vladimir Putin and that side of things. He is very far to the left, and also not keen on NATO. So there's quite a lot of similarities between his support and Marine Le Pen's support, which I'll be coming to a little bit later when I talk about Marine Le Pen. Just to say quickly, Marine Le Pen is Leo, Macron is Sagittarius, Fillon is Pisces, Hamon Cancer, Mélenchon is Leo as well. Right, so let's get cracking and talk about the chart of France, which you see here. Now this is the chart of the Fifth Republic, and so it begins on in October 1958. You can see there France has Aries rising, lots of planets in Libra, and a rather interesting configuration where it's got Capricorn on the midheaven. Now what struck me immediately about France's chart is it's very similar to the UK chart, because it's got this big cardinal influence. So where they've got Aries rising, the UK's got Libra rising. Both of them have the moon in Cancer. So both these countries are very strongly, a strong nationalist trend. They're very patriotic countries. With this influence of cardinal signs, both sports-loving, very competitive. You can see why these two countries are allies but also foes, that they lock horns, they're quite competitive with each other. You can see why that works out. And but what is very different between France's chart and the UK chart is, as you can see, all the planets, nearly all the planets in France's chart are in this hemisphere, the hemisphere of the other. Strong influence of 3 planets, Sun, Mercury and Venus in Libra. France is a country that likes to work very strongly with other nations. You can see there the North Node and the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, which is a very important conjunction in France's horoscope, is in the 7th house. So they're very focused on teamwork, cooperation, treaties with other nations. And so it seems to be in the makeup of this Fifth Republic chart that France were destined to be in a union like the EU And if you think about it, France and Germany, they are the EU. They were the founding members. They were right in there, the most powerful members. In many ways, they say that someone like Emmanuel Macron, he's vying to be Angela Merkel's number 2, because that's how it is within the EU. So it's far less likely that France would ever leave. So even if someone like Marine Le Pen or Mélenchon won, it's very unlikely they'd get any plans to leave the EU through Parliament. France are really wedded to this idea. The whole makeup of the country is geared towards this cooperation, so I don't think they'd pull out of that very easily at all. Whether they stay in the euro, of course, that's another question. I see that their chart ruler, because they've got Aries rising, the chart ruler Mars is in their second house, the house of finances, and I think France will see the UK leaving the EU as a massive opportunity to stake their claim on being the financial capital of the world, because that second house, they've got ambitions to be a financial centre. So I think they'll want to hang in there in the EU and capitalise on that chance to just take over London's position if they possibly can. What France don't seem to have, like the UK, we have a sort of an island mentality where they're very much part of the continent of Europe and have a strong identity connected to that. So what do we all know about France? And Paris, it's the country of romance, very strong influence on culture and the arts, and that is typified by the fact that we have Mercury and the Sun in Libra and Venus in Libra. The fact that we have Moon in Cancer in the 4th house, also agriculture, massive part of the French economy is agriculture and also tourism. So that's all reflected there. We see Pluto is represented there in the 6th house. France is a nuclear power and they're very keen on their nuclear energy, whereas Germany and Italy have ditched that. And they're also arms trading is one of the big things that France are involved with. And as a member of the Security Council, they are very much involved in world affairs. What I find quite interesting is the chart ruler Mars is square Pluto. Now that always means violence, and now France have been a country that's been blighted by terrorism because of their involvement in the African countries, colonies like Algeria. There's always been an element of tourism and of terrorism, and as you'll see, we'll be talking about during the whole spate of terrorism that's been going on in France, that aspect has been being touched off. Now, in France's chart, they've got this thing, this Jupiter-Neptune conjunction. Now, the astrological researchers say that that was extremely active at the end of the Fourth Republic. Every time these planets made an angle, either a positive angle or a negative angle to each other, something was happening, like a Suez Canal crisis and the rapprochement, I think they called it, between France and Germany, getting money from America. It was always something important. So we got to look out when we look in the transits for anything that's touching off those two planets, because it will be an indication of something that is important going to happen in France. So what's been happening at the moment? I think it might be important just to take a look back now. Now, the important events in France lately was the invasion, or the regime change in Libya, which Sarkozy and Cameron were very much on board with. And the pivotal date there was the 19th of March 2011. And at that time, planet Pluto was right dead on the midheaven in Capricorn. So Pluto, of course, power planet, France sort of taking a leading role in the world events in Libya there, Pluto on the midheaven. At the same time, you had Neptune on the cusp of their 12th house and also squaring Mars. And as I said, every time there's some sort of war or terrorism, we're going to look for Mars, Pluto being touched off. And it was by Neptune. And I think the fact that Neptune was involved was kind of foreshadowing the events that weren't going to be very successful. It's been a disaster in Libya, what can we say? And because Neptune was there, I think that told the story, that it was just going to become another basket case. At the same time, the Sun was also in orb of a conjunction, Saturn was in orb of a conjunction with the Sun. And when we see that, we see France assuming a very proactive role in world politics. And during the Mali intervention, again, military action by France, Pluto was again touching off the midheaven there, and Neptune again was affecting Mars. Now, I don't know how that all went. I suppose things are just bubbling under the surface, probably not as important as what's going on in Syria for us to know about. During the time of Charlie Hebdo, the North Node was conjuncting the Sun-Mercury conjunction in the 6th house. 6th house is often an unlucky place, and as I've talked about in the chart of America, every time the North Node is active, it's a pivotal time for countries, often involving something like terrorism or war, or something like that a country's involved in. So it's quite interesting that the North Node was also touching off Mercury and Mercury rules communications, Charlie Hebdo magazine, of course. And at that time, Neptune again was active, triggering off Mars, Pluto, which I said is always linked to terrorism, and Uranus was squaring them at heaven. You know, this came as a total surprise. No one really at that stage saw it coming. During the Bataclan, it was Pluto who was conjuncting the Sun, Mercury conjunction. So of course Pluto is involved in this difficult conjunction that affects and overshadows the whole of the chart, and the fact that it was again active doesn't surprise me at all. So Pluto, of course, because it's been moving through Capricorn, has been triggering off all their cardinal points, which is why France has been suffering this terrorism. It's all really down to Pluto. It's moving off for a while now, Pluto, but it is going to, at the end of 2019, 2020, it will be again influencing the Moon, which you see there is in Cancer, opposing the Moon. And at that stage, I'm thinking France is going to be at the forefront of possibly military action, maybe as part of a coalition, because when they joined the coalition against Iraq back in 1991, the two planets, Neptune and Uranus, were up here going through the 10th house. So it seems to me now, with the Pluto going through the 10th house, that there could again be some sort of military action. I'm thinking it's going to be linked to Syria and Turkey, and France may be heavily involved in that. As far as these elections coming up, in the solar arcs, we can see there that the solar arc Mars, which of course important planet, being France's ruler, is touching off Saturn, the Neptune-Jupiter conjunction, and so is Pluto. Now the Neptune-Jupiter conjunction's always been an important one in France, and it does indicate extremism. And if we go back to the chart here, who are doing well in the polls? We've got Marine Le Pen on the far right, we've got Mélenchon on the far left, and Hamon was on the far left. So for the first time, we actually are looking at the possibility of going into the second round. We could have had candidate Marine Le Pen from the far right and one from the far left, and that's indicative of what I see there with that particular conjunction, with France looking to take a whole new approach in terms of politics. So if Le Pen does make it into the second round, it becomes far more difficult for her to win, because it's all about where support is going to go to next. And it seems, because she has a lot in common with Mélenchon in terms of them both being against the EU, wanting to see peace and good relations with Russia, against NATO and that sort of stance, that she could be getting some support from Mélenchon, but 40% of his supporters have indicated they'll just sit it out as a protest vote and they won't have anything to do with the second round if he doesn't go through. She could do well from François Fillon's supporters, attracting some of his, because he is engaged in a bit of a dog whistle politics. He's moved himself to the right, so he could draw in more of Le Pen supporters, but if he goes out in the next round, I see that Marine Le Pen could capitalise on many of his. And then of course there's Macron, but we've already talked about it. He's not such a sure thing, because so many of his supporters are uncertain about him. But I want to look more at these candidates in the next vlogs. I thought I'd break it up a little bit, because there seems so much to say that we may as well divide it into three, and I'll just keep you into suspense with who I think is going to go through to the second round and what I think is going to happen there. It might just be worth mentioning that in France's chart, where I talked about the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, the other time it was triggered by transiting Pluto this time was when the Treaty of Rome, which was one of those pivotal treaties that paved the way for the EU as we know today as this big sort of political social bloc. It was at the time that that was triggered. And also in 1969 there were a lot of protests, anti-capitalism protests in France and around Germany as well, and that was the time when Charles de Gaulle was brought down, and not so long after that Francois Mitterrand, who was the first president of the Fifth Republic from the left, and also one of the longest serving to get in. So you can see that back in 1969 there was this shift away to the left, which is something that hadn't happened before, and of course it was an important part during the Treaty of Rome. But I'm thinking that when that's triggered off, it symbolises that in French history there's going to be a shift. And since Macron is very much the candidate of the establishment of the now, he's the no-change candidate, and Fillon also is very much the no-change candidate. It leads me to think that Le Pen and even Mélenchon have a good chance of taking this further.